Netanyahu will present President Trump with Israel's view on a deal or a military strike on the Islamic Republic. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the full story.
Unlike other recent Netanyahu trips to Washington, this time the Prime Minister will return home shortly after his meeting with Trump. The Prime Minister is scheduled to return to Israel Thursday noon, landing early Friday morning. The apparent reason for the rushed visit is to avoid being in Washington later on Thursday when Trump convenes his Board of Peace, where Netanyahu could be seen and photographed alongside regional leaders who have been heavily critical of Israel.
בנסיעה הזאת אנחנו נדון בשורה של נושאים, עזה, האזור, אבל כמובן בראש ובראשונה במשא ומתן עם איראן. אני אציג בפני הנשיא את התפיסות שלנו לגבי העקרונות במשא ומתן, העקרונות החשובים, ובעיניי הם עקרונות חשובים לא רק לישראל, אלא לכל מי שבעולם רוצה שלום וביטחון במזרח התיכון.
The urgent summit comes as talks between the United States and Iran are due to continue in Oman, with the possibility of an American military strike on Iran in place and awaiting orders. Israeli concern is now focused on the risk of a deal that leaves Iran's ballistic missile program untouched. Netanyahu will argue that the current talks are focused primarily on the nuclear file, while Iran continues to develop long-range ballistic missiles that pose what Israel describes as an existential threat. Netanyahu reportedly believes his personal relationship with Trump could be decisive. Senior Israeli officials say that in previous closed-door meetings, when the Prime Minister presented Israel's core security needs, Trump backed Israel fully. Netanyahu now wants to ensure that the president does not back away from red lines agreed upon in earlier summits and talks led by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff. The Prime Minister is also expected to argue that this is an historic opportunity. Iran, he will say, is weakened, its regional proxies are under pressure, and its missile program must be curbed now, including limits on range and production to prevent future war. Netanyahu is also expected to signal Israel's willingness to support any American military action, framing Israel as a force multiplier rather than a liability.
Meanwhile, in Iran, executions are continuing and a fresh wave of arrests of political reformists. All the while, the regime continues to build up their ballistic missile arsenal. Let's take a look.
In Iran this week, authorities arrested several prominent figures identified with the reformist camp, including Azar Mansouri, head of the Reform Front coalition, along with two former parliamentarians. According to Iranian state media, they were detained on charges including acting against national security and coordinating with foreign media. The arrests were announced as part of what officials described as a crackdown on internal dissent. However, the so-called reformists are not an external opposition movement. They're a recognized faction within the structure of the Islamic Republic, operating under the same constitutional framework and ultimate authority of the supreme leader. The detentions come amid continuing public unrest and chants calling not for reform, but for an end to the system itself. In recent years, protesters have increasingly rejected the reformist hardliner divide and have called for regime change, with many expressing support for Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi as a transitional leader. Analysts note that throughout the history of the Islamic Republic, internal factions have been managed, marginalized, or temporarily targeted during periods of heightened pressure from the international community to give the illusion of change in the necessary direction, while the core power structure of the regime always remains intact. At the same time, Iran continues to advance its military capabilities. New reports show the regime is producing hundreds of ballistic missiles per month in underground facilities designed to protect its arsenal from potential strikes. The missiles include both liquid and solid fuel systems with ranges capable of reaching Israel and other regional targets. The expansion is taking place even as diplomatic talks with Western powers continue, and while Iran has refused to place limits on its ballistic missile program in any negotiation framework.
Well, as the negotiations continue between the U.S. and the Islamic regime in Iran, joining us now to discuss the latest developments is former Deputy National Security Advisor Chuck Freilich. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you on here. Where do you think things stand today with the Trump administration? Has any actual progress been made towards a deal, given the regime's actions and statements as well?
Well, I think where things stand is really something that's only knowable if you have direct access to President Trump's thinking. He keeps his cards very close to him, and he also is capable of changing his mind at any point. I think we're reaching a stage where a decision will have to be made. It doesn't have to be made this week or next week. I think Trump can still play for time here. The talks have begun. They made at least enough progress so that both sides expressed an interest to continue them. Whether the unclear.
Now, what would a successful deal actually look like for the United States? Because the reality is, of course, we know the regime can't be trusted to keep its word based on history. They're still executing Iranians throughout this week even. So what would a deal look like?
Well, we know what we would like a deal to look like. And here, there's actually no daylight between the U.S. and Israel. There may be daylight in terms of what each side is willing to settle for. The ideal agreement would basically end Iran's entire military nuclear program, no enrichment whatsoever, removing the existing highly enriched uranium stockpile out of Iran, and some other measures on the nuclear issue. It would include a complete ban, at least on their long-range missiles, the ones capable of reaching Israel, and an end to their support for the various proxies in the region. Now, where there may be daylight between the sides is that Trump may wish to settle for a deal which focuses solely or primarily on the nuclear issue. Israel doesn't want to see the other two issues left aside, especially since at the moment, in the short term, the more pressing issue is actually the missiles and not the nuclear issue. It's, of course, the greater danger in the long term. It's truly an existential threat, but at the moment, the program hasn't advanced in any significant way since the attack in June. And the ballistic missile program, conversely, is progressing significantly, even rapidly. The good news here is that while they're building lots of rockets or lots of missiles, they have apparently not been able to rebuild the launcher arsenal. So they've got lots of missiles that they can fire on fewer launchers, which makes it harder for them to do so, to launch them, and somewhat easier for us to, or for the U.S. to attack them because there are fewer targets.
Well, we do see Prime Minister Netanyahu making an urgent trip to Washington now. In your take, what is Israel's concern here with the deal? You mentioned the hesitation about an only nuclear deal. Is it even theoretically possible that we would see Israel act alone militarily in the event that we don't see a good deal in Israel's eyes?
I don't think Israel has the freedom of maneuver today to do something against Mr. Trump's wishes. Now, if he's willing to okay an operation or just give a nod, even an unspoken yellow light, but something that's clearly understood, that's one thing. But I don't think we can act without the U.S. There's a possibility that this operation, just like in June, might end up being a joint operation. Unlike June, this time it would presumably be the U.S., the leading actor, with Israel providing additional support, whereas in June it was precisely the opposite.
All right, well, we will have to stay tuned and keep you updated on what happens with that. We'll be following the talks closely. But I want to thank you, former National Security Advisor Chuck Freilich. Thank you.
Thank you.
The story of the Jewish people has never been about standing still. It's a story of moving forward, of taking responsibility, of protecting what matters, no matter the challenge. That story is still being written today, not with swords, but with stewardship of the land, with the rule of law, and with a determination to secure Israel's future. And on the front lines of that mission stands Regavim. Regavim is a public movement dedicated to defending Israel's national lands and natural resources in the field, in the courts, and
after the incident. He also revealed just how far Iran's drone must have traveled as part of its supposedly routine and legal send a drone to show that the carrier could be hit. This was supposed to be Iranian power, a showcase of strength that would convince the US that it needs to stay away. But the US responded to Iran's jab with a haymaker. The US F-35 just sent Iran a deadly message in the Arabian Sea as tensions rise and a powder keg looks set to explode. It all started in mid-January. As protests erupted in the streets of Iran, the US sent warnings not to shut them down, and Iran did it anyway. By January 15th, the US had responded by sending a US Navy supercarrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, in the direction of the Middle East. The carrier went on its way, flanked by its strike group. Heading from the South China Sea, where it had been conducting live fire exercises, the USS Abraham Lincoln moved toward Iran and eventually reached the Arabian Sea. Iran watched all of this unfold, and it had something planned for the USS Abraham Lincoln's arrival. The US would have an impressive answer to that plan, as we'll get into in a minute. But as for Iran's big move, it was made on February 3rd. Unhappy about the presence of the US carrier in such close proximity, Iran sent a single drone that the US reports aggressively approached the carrier. It's unknown if that drone was intended to strike if it got close enough. We don't know if the drone was equipped with a warhead capable of doing much damage, but the drone had an unclear intent, Reuters reports, and it had to be dealt with. Right now, there's some confusion about what type of drone Iran sent. According to Reuters, it was a Shahed 139, which is among the most modern long-range strike drones that Iran has in its arsenal. Not a lot is known about this drone. Defense and Security Monitor says that it's believed to be an upgraded version of the Shahed 129, which it says has a range of 2,000 kilometers or about 1,242 miles, and an operating endurance of 24 hours, enabling long-distance flight. Presumably the Shahed 139 can fly further and longer and may also be capable of carrying a larger warhead. It's believed to have entered service in 2024, making it conceivable that it was the type of drone that Iran sent. However, other sources claim that it wasn't a Shahed 139. What Iran actually sent may have been a Shahed 129. Tasnim News says as much in an X-post. The same outlet claimed that there was nothing suspicious about the Shahed 129 doing what it was doing. In an interview with Tasnim, an informed source said about a British media report that an American plane targeted an Iranian drone over the Abraham Lincoln. The Shahed 129 drone was conducting its usual and legal mission in open waters, conducting reconnaissance, surveillance, and taking pictures, and this is considered a routine and legal action, the outlet claimed. Sure, every country sends drones into open waters that just so happen to approach aircraft carriers erratically. Assuming it was indeed a Shahed 129 that Iran sent to the USS Abraham Lincoln's direction, then it could have been on a strike mission. As Odin reports, the Shahed 129 has two twin hardpoints that enable it to carry 4 munitions, which combine to give the drone a potential payload of 400 kilograms or 881 pounds. This is no insignificant amount of firepower, assuming the drone that Iran sent was fully loaded. The US had to take it seriously, and what it did to stop the Shahed drone could have ramifications that affect the entire Middle East. We'll get to what those ramifications are a little later. First, you need to know what the US actually did, and learn about another little trick that Iran tried to pull on the same day that it deployed its drone. As the Iranian Shahed approached the American carrier, it was being tracked all the way. Warnings were sent, and they weren't heeded. So the US decided to fight fire with fire, or more accurately, it chose to fight an ember with a blazing inferno. If Iran was going to send a drone as a threat to the US, then America would respond to that threat with one of its most powerful aerial platforms, the F-35. As the War Zone, or TWZ, reports, the US unleashed an F-35C Joint Strike Fighter on Iran's drone. The fighter jet easily handled the drone, shooting it down in an instant, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody given the complete mismatch in firepower on display. After all, stuff like this is the F-35C's bread and butter. As Max Afterburner explains in his YouTube video covering the American response, the F-35C is the carrier version of the typical Joint Strike Fighter, and it's built for stealthy strikes and ensuring that the US maintains air superiority. F-35Cs are made to operate in contested zones, and their top speed of about Mach 1.6 means they can fly circles around something as comparatively simplistic as a Shahed drone. Iran's drone never stood a chance. US Navy Captain Tim Hawkins, who is the spokesperson for US Central Command, explains what happened next. Or at least he explains what the US is willing to reveal about what it did to Iran's Shahed. An F-35C fighter jet from Abraham Lincoln shot down the Iranian drone in self-defense and to protect the aircraft carrier and personnel on board. No American service members were harmed during the incident, and no U.S. equipment was damaged, Hawkins reported after the incident. He also revealed just how far Iran's drone must have traveled as part of its supposedly routine and legal mission. USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, was transiting the Arabian Sea approximately 500 miles from Iran's southern coast when an Iranian Shahed 139 drone unnecessarily maneuvered toward the ship, Hawkins added, which immediately makes the Tasnim news report look more than a little bit silly. Sure, you could argue that using drones in your territorial waters is legal and routine, but using them 500 miles from the Iranian coast, when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea says that countries generally control the waters up to about 12 nautical miles from their coastlines, the claim that Iran's Shahed was operating routinely and legally starts to look a little rich in that context. Even if you take exclusive economic zones into account, Iran could only feasibly claim to control 200 miles beyond its coastlines before its drones hit international waters. This wasn't a legal move by Iran, and the US let Iran know about it. But what we don't know, at least not yet, is precisely what America's F-35C used to destroy the Iranian Shahed. Frankly, the fighter jet has a glut of options to choose from. TWZ lists the most likely candidates. The F-35C could have used AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. That would be one of the cheaper options, Max Afterburner says, though not by much. At about $900,000 per unit, the US could have saved itself about $100,000 compared to using another of the F-35C's options, the AIM-120 Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile. At a cool $1 million per unit, these are some of the best air-to-air missiles available anywhere in the world. Either option would be more than enough to take out a single Shahed drone. However, using them would be overkill to a massive degree, but then perhaps that was the point. Sending an F-35C to a drone fight is the equivalent of having a UFC fighter square off against a toddler. There's only going to be one winner, and it's not going to be little Timmy. Using either of these missiles against Iran's Shahed drone would be like hitting that poor little guy with a Superman punch when his back is turned. It's just not a fair fight. Perhaps a more likely candidate for what the F-35C's pilot used against Iran's Shahed was the aircraft's 25mm gun pod, which has 4 barrels and can rattle off a maximum of 181 rounds according to key.aero. The F-35C also has a missionized gun system, which can fire up to 220 rounds. Either could have destroyed Iran's Shahed with a quick burst. Frankly, it almost doesn't matter what weapon was used. The mere fact that an F-35C was deployed is a show of force that Iran couldn't have been expecting. After all, the US has dealt with Iranian drones before, only not with quite so much firepower. Back in 2019, TWZ reported that the US had deployed marine anti-drone buggies to take out an Iranian drone that had approached the Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, the USS Boxer. The drone got to within a threatening range and was taken out. So perhaps the message that the US sent on February 3rd was as much about revealing that it has enough options for dealing with Shaheds as it was about hitting as hard as it possibly could against Iran's little threat. Max Afterburner makes that point, noting that the F-35C is a good choice for dealing with a single threat while sending a message. But if Iran had gotten overconfident, perhaps by sending an entire drone swarm, the US might have taken a different approach. The USS Abraham Lincoln could have sent an EA-18G Growler into the fight, as that airframe is equipped with electronic warfare systems that can send Shaheds veering far off course. The Growler is actually a tweaked version of the FA-18, Afterburner says, so it's not like the jet is helpless without its electronic warfare equipment. Ultimately, what we've just seen Iran try to do is test the US. Iran tweaked the American nose and it learned precisely what will happen if it does something so stupid. And it already looks like Iran is trying to calm things down, as you'll learn if you keep on watching for our analysis of the aftermath of this event. But before we dig into that, Iran's Shahed utterly failing to present any sort of threat to the US wasn't the only story to come out of February 3rd. On the very same day, Iran tried to project its power in the Strait of Hormuz, and it's fair to say that the projection fell flat on its face. According to Bloomberg, Iran made the strange decision to send a handful of small armed ships into the Strait of Hormuz, where they proceeded to hail an oil tanker that is part of a US military fuel procurement program. The ships were crewed by members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they reportedly harassed the US vessel, named the Stena Imperative, with threats that they were going to board and seize the tanker. That little escapade didn't go over particularly well. The US deployed a guided missile destroyer to the location of the incident, yet again sending a message to Iran. The Revolutionary Guard can have their small gunships, but they're not going to do much when faced by a true American warship. Max Afterburner offers a funny assessment of the whole situation. He points out that the Iranian vessels were equipped with .50 caliber machine guns and small reconnaissance drones when they attempted to board the Stena Imperative. The only reason that the fast boats and the drone didn't get to the oil tanker to board was because a US Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer stepped in as a bodyguard and shooed them away very kindly. Afterburner says, adding, "I'm sure they were basically like, hey, go ahead and step this way, Iranian fast boats, or you're going to meet with our friends, a 30mm gun." As with the F-35C and the Shahid, there would only have been one winner in that fight. For the record, Iran once again claimed that it was doing nothing more than monitoring its territorial waters, and that the US tanker failed to provide the appropriate legal documents for transit through the Strait of Hormuz. That seems unlikely. What is far more likely is that Iran was once again trying to send a message to the US, with that message being that it could turn the Strait of Hormuz into a choke point if it wants to. Whether Iran could actually do that is irrelevant. The threat that it could pose is enough, as the Strait of Hormuz is a very important passageway. It enables ships to enter and exit the Persian Gulf safely, making it a major waterway. As the US Energy Information Administration pointed out in June 2025, around 20 million barrels of crude oil, crude condensate, and petroleum products pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That amounts to about 20% of the entire world's global petroleum liquid consumption, the administration says. The BBC adds that Iran technically has some control over which ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait and its shipping lanes are entirely within Iran and Oman's territorial waters. Should Iran choose to block the strait, it could potentially do so using submarines and fast attack boats, like the one that harried the US tanker. Those boats wouldn't form a blockade. They could lay mines to make it clear to any vessel that braves the strait that there is a lot of risk involved. What we saw on February 3rd was a hint from Iran that it could cause a lot of trouble in the Strait of Hormuz. Whether it would actually do that depends on how much it's worried about the almost inevitable US response that would come after. And that brings us nicely back to what is going to happen next after Iran's two aggressive incidents against American vessels. Are we going to see the USS Abraham Lincoln and its carrier strike group go on the attack? Are American fighter jets going to bombard Iranian military sites with missiles and bombs as they did during Operation Midnight Hammer in the summer of 2025? The answer seems to be no, at least not yet. In the wake of this pair of incidents, the US seems to have decided to continue trying to take a diplomatic route with Iran, rather than responding with more force than may be necessary. Speaking to Fox News, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed what had happened with the USS Abraham Lincoln, but noted that President Donald Trump is committed to pursuing diplomacy and that his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will still be traveling to a meeting with Iranian delegates on February 7th. Leavitt did say that Trump, as always, is leaving his options open. As of right now, Witkoff is set to be having conversations with the Iranians later this week, claims Leavitt, before adding, "Those are still scheduled as of right now, but of course, the president has always a range of options on the table, and that includes the use of military force. The Iranians know that better than anyone." Iran also seems to be wary about the impending meeting collapsing. However, it's also been trying to project power related to them. As The Guardian reports, the discussion between Witkoff and Iran's delegates was originally supposed to take place in Turkey. However, Iran later demanded that they take place in Oman, and that they happen without the presence of a group of Arab states that are presumably going to serve some sort of mediation role. The US initially rejected this request, which placed the meeting in jeopardy. However, a last-ditch effort by the Arab states in question appears to have convinced the White House to change its course. For those states, these talks are essential because they will cover Iran's nuclear program and could end up being a key step toward an agreement being formed that enables the regulation of said program. We'll have to see what happens on February 7th to learn if the US making this concession was worth it. As for what Iran did on February 3rd, Max Afterburner says that these attacks are right out of Iran's playbook in terms of offering plausible deniability. Not in the sense that Iran will claim it had nothing to do with what happened, it obviously did, and it has said as much with its various claims about protecting its waters, even though some of those claims are shaky. The deniability comes from the scale of the attacks. Iran sent one drone to the USS Abraham Lincoln rather than a swarm. It backed off when the US warship arrived to guide the Stena Imperative through the Strait of Hormuz. All of this is a flex, not Iran preparing for a fight. Still, Iran has a problem that it hasn't yet solved. Its response to the protests we mentioned right at the start of the video could still cause issues. Trump had already warned Iran that the US would take action if Iran cracked down on the protests to the point of executing its own citizens. The US president has also claimed that Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, should be very worried about what might lie in store for his country if an agreement isn't reached during the upcoming meeting between Witkoff and the Iranian delegates. On the protest front, Iran's regime certainly doesn't seem to have heeded Trump's warning. As Amnesty International says, thousands of protesters have been arrested, and there are now concerns about them being tortured and otherwise assaulted while they're in captivity. There have also been claims that at least 30,000 people died during the protests, and that bodies were disappearing while others were being buried in mass graves. will all of this come up during the nuclear talks? Possibly, though it currently seems that the US is more concerned about getting those talks over the line than it is about following through on its past threats. Iran's regime may have tried its luck on February 3rd because it's grown bullish in the wake of the lack of a US response related to its crackdown on the protests. Just 2 days before the drone and fast boat incidents, Khamenei himself warned that any attack on his country would spark a regional war that would quickly spiral out of control. The Americans should know that if they start a war, this time it will be a regional war, Iran's supreme leader said. Though, as with anything that comes out of Khamenei's mouth, it's difficult to tell what is posturing and what is real. The same could be said for Trump in some respects, as both sides seem to be now engaged in a dangerous form of negotiation in which they're using very real weapons to get what they want out of a nuclear program deal. The one thing that Iran knows for sure is that the US can and has hit hard in the very recent past. Testing boundaries is one thing. Iran is lucky that the US is still pursuing diplomatic solutions on the nuclear front. However, if things go south during the meeting on February 7th, we may well be looking at what happened 4 days before as warning shots being delivered by both sides. And if they were, America's shots were much stronger, and Iran's regime would have received the deadly message they delivered loud and clear. As for the US, it's been busy on several fronts over the past week. At around the same time that it was dealing with Iran's aggression, the US announced the successful live fire testing of a weapon.
تاریخ 17/11/1404 ساعت 10:25 همین الان ستاد کل ارتش.
This is Tehran, and it's engulfed in flames once again. Time is running out for the regime. Negotiations have stalled, and the US has issued emergency evacuation orders for its citizens in Iran. The capital is rocked by multiple explosions, including at the Army General Headquarters barracks. The Revolutionary Guard's supposedly impregnable stronghold, the famous Padagon II barracks, was blasted last night in a suspicious accident. As sirens echoed through the streets, the regime declared a state of emergency on Tehran's main arteries and city entrances and exits immediately after the explosion. On a night when negotiations collapsed and the US Navy anchored at the mouth of the Gulf, this explosion in the heart of the capital carries a strategic message beyond coincidence. The Tehran administration is now quarantining its own capital, fearing internal weakness more than external enemies. On the night of February 6th, mysterious explosions occurred in the Hashmetiya neighborhood, known as Tehran's most sterile and secure area. Although the regime's official agencies tried to dismiss the incident as a simple carpenter's workshop fire, images from the scene revealed a much darker picture. The building engulfed in flames was not an ordinary workshop, but the General Staff Headquarters, the nerve center of the Iranian regime. Initial images from the scene on social media and local residents claimed that the fire and explosion occurred inside the Padagon Support Barracks, number 2, affiliated with the Iranian Armed Forces General Headquarters. The flames could not be extinguished even hours later. The first images leaked from the scene clearly showed the panic-stricken rush of military personnel and the sound of sirens, revealing how the regime was unable to manage the chaos in its capital. When we delve into the technical aspects of the incident, the picture that emerges shows that the myth of the impregnable fortress that the regime has been building for years has been destroyed. Military experts and OSINT analysts point out that it is impossible for such a large amount of flammable material to be found unchecked in an area with high security zone status, that is, a red zone, such as the General Staff compound, which could cause such a large explosion. The time of the explosion, around 10 p.m., is a critical time frame when cyber operations or sabotage teams are typically active and when attention is often divided due to shift changes. At this point, we should focus on the strange military activity that took place in the streets of Tehran immediately after the explosion, which we can call auto-blockade. The regime declared a state of emergency on Tehran's main arteries and at the city's entry and exit points immediately after the explosion. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC units, took to the streets in full gear and began stopping civilian vehicles with unprecedented paranoia. In a traditional perception of external threat, one would expect the army to rush to the borders or air defense positions. But the fact that the IRGC turned its guns on its own people and the streets of its own capital reveals the regime's level of panic. Videos leaked from checkpoints over the past few days show soldiers focusing particularly on the trunk areas of vehicles and searching for drones. This detail reveals the source of the Tehran administration's fear: the enemy within. The regime knows that this attack was not carried out by a missile fired from outside, but by quadcopter-style kamikaze drones launched from within Tehran itself, or by sabotage from within. The fact that the fire that reduced that strategic building in the Hashmatieh neighborhood to rubble came not from an aircraft miles away, but perhaps from the roof of a building a few blocks away, or from inside a package, proves the inadequacy of Iranian intelligence, namely the MOIS, in ensuring the capital's security. This quarantine situation in the streets is not a medical measure, but a political strangulation move. Reducing internet bandwidth, restricting access to social media, and halting public transportation deprives the public of their right to information, while also aiming to prevent the organization of any potential social movement. The fact that the U.S. State Department is calling on its citizens to leave Iran immediately at this very moment and is pointing to the land borders of Armenia or Turkey as escape routes confirms the gravity of the situation. Washington anticipates that what will happen on the streets of Tehran may not be just a protest, but could turn into an uncontrolled internal conflict. This carpentry workshop lie actually shows that the regime's communication strategy is also bankrupt. The administration, which similarly resorted to gas leak excuses during the 12-day war in June 2025, can no longer even convince its own base. The fact that a fire in a carpenter's workshop next to a military barracks disabled the country's most critical command center screams that logistical and security discipline has been destroyed. If this was truly an accident, it is even more terrifying, because the question of how an army that cannot protect its own headquarters from a carpenter's mistake will resist the approaching American armada is spreading through the streets of Tehran via whispering campaigns. While Tehran is engulfed in flames, the ground is also slipping away from Iran on the diplomatic front. The negotiating table set up in Muscat, the capital of Oman, collapsed before the parties even sat down. The Tehran administration tried yet another of its usual buying time tactics, demanding that the format of the talks be changed and that the subject be limited to the nuclear dossier. However, the response from Washington this time did not contain diplomatic courtesy. On the contrary, it contained a clear and unequivocal rejection. The U.S. delegation rejected Iran's last-minute maneuver and sat down at the table insisting on a full package. This package covers not only nuclear weapons, but also the ballistic missile program, regional proxy forces, and human rights violations. In other words, America sent Iran the message, either you surrender completely or you leave the table. The fact that the negotiations stalled so quickly is actually part of the White House's new strategy. President Trump closed the curtains on the diplomatic theater and pulled the pin on the economic bomb. The new executive order signed by the White House envisages imposing an additional 25% customs duty on all countries trading with Iran, with China, the largest buyer of Iranian oil, being the main target. This move created a shockwave that will shake global trade balances. This decree is not just a tax regulation, but a surgical intervention aimed at cutting off the Iranian regime's oxygen supply. As the diplomatic circle narrows, the real threat materializes in the form of steel piles looming on the horizon. The waters of the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea are hosting the largest military buildup in recent years. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group, along with its accompanying destroyers and logistics support ships, is sailing just within firing range of the Iranian coast. This massive armada is not just a show of force, but also an operational readiness. CENTCOM's increased presence in the region and its explicit declaration of this presence indicate that Washington has now moved from the deterrence phase to the coercion phase. The threats from Iranian officials that, if you attack, there will be serious consequences, ring hollow in the face of this technological and military asymmetry. Traffic in the skies is at least as dense and threatening as it is at sea. Not only the US Air Force, but also the Royal Air Force is now part of the equation. The 6 British F-35 fighter jets deployed to the region, with their stealth technology, pose a nightmare scenario for Iran's air defense systems. However, The real game changer is the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft sent to the region. This aircraft is a flying command center that can instantly monitor and coordinate all air movements, missile launches, and aircraft takeoffs over an area of hundreds of kilometers. The arrival of the E-3 Sentry means that the brain of a potential air operation is now in place. This aircraft aims to establish complete domination in Iranian airspace by transmitting target information to F-35s and Tomahawk missiles launched from ships. On the Israeli front, silence is the greatest harbinger of the storm. Information leaked from Tel Aviv claims that the Israeli Air Force and military intelligence have approved final strike plans against Iran. These plans, signed by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Security Cabinet, now raise the question of when, not if. It is known that the plans cover not only nuclear facilities, but also the regime's vital organs, command centers, energy transmission lines, and ballistic missile depots. The threat by Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander Sikbari that "we will strike Israel in minutes" is nothing more than a desperate bluff by a power that cannot protect its own general staff building in its capital. With that explosion in Tehran, Israel has shown the world and the Iranian people that there is a massive hole in Iran's defense shield. When we delve into the details of the economic strangulation strategy, the bleakness of the picture becomes clearer. The Iranian regime has been surviving for years by selling oil to China via tankers with their transponders turned off, a practice they call the shadow fleet. However, the threat of this 25% tariff is forcing the Beijing administration to conduct a serious cost-benefit analysis. For Chinese banks and refineries, the profit margin on discounted oil from Iran cannot compensate for the 25% loss in access to the US market. This situation means that Iran's oil revenues will suddenly be halted. The interruption of revenue flows is a harbinger of hyperinflation, problems accessing basic foodstuffs, and ultimately more unrest on the streets for the Iranian people, who are already in the grip of an economic crisis. The US State Department's targeted sanctions against 14 ships and 15 entities involved in transporting Iranian oil form the maritime component of this economic siege. Blacklisting these ships makes it impossible for them to dock at international ports, obtain insurance, or even refuel. The cash flow used by the regime to finance the Revolutionary Guards and proxy forces, such as Hezbollah, is now at risk of being wiped out by these moves. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's explicit admission that they are targeting the Iranian currency with dollar manipulation shows how ruthlessly the war is being waged not only on the battlefield, but also on bank servers and currency markets. Every devaluation of the Iranian rial is a piece torn from the regime's legitimacy. Amidst all this military encirclement, the real factor causing the regime's psychological collapse is the rise of an alternative leadership figure within the country. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's call for a global rally on February 14th found an unexpected echo in the streets of Tehran. The public's nostalgia for the pre-1979 era, the monarchy, combined with their hatred for the regime, is turning into a dangerous mixture. Archive footage circulating on social media showing an elderly woman expressing her longing for the king demonstrates that the regime's ideological legitimacy has completely vanished. People now want not only economic prosperity, but also the restoration of lost honor and national identity. This situation reminds us that the regime must face not only military defeat, but also a social revolution. Looking at the course of events, the fire in Tehran may have been extinguished, but the embers beneath the ashes continue to burn the foundations of the regime. The carpenter's workshop lie is the most tragicomic example of how a state's seriousness has gone. A government that erects barricades against its own people in its own capital, cutting off the internet to hide from the world, has actually become a prisoner of its own fear. With the American Navy at the door, Israeli jets on alert, and most importantly, the Iranian people waiting in the streets, the mullahs have nowhere left to run. The lights that went out that night were, in fact, a metaphor for the regime's darkening future.
Israel warned the US that it could strike Iran alone over its missiles. The Jerusalem Post reported, citing sources, "We told the Americans that we would strike alone if Iran crossed our red line regarding ballistic missiles." The newspaper source noted, Tel Aviv considers Iran's missile weapons program an existential threat and does not rule out unilateral action if necessary. Furthermore, sources fear that if U.S. President Donald Trump decides to strike Iran, the operation will be limited. Washington could select a few targets, declare success, and leave Israel to deal with the consequences as it did with the Houthis. Meanwhile, Iran has warned that in the event of an attack by the United States, the Republic will strike American bases in the Persian Gulf region. The officials stressed that Israel reserves freedom of action and emphasized that it will not allow Iran to restore strategic weapon systems on a scale that threatens Israel's existence. One defense official described the current moment as a historic opportunity to deliver a significant blow to Iran's missile infrastructure and neutralize active threats to Israel and neighboring states. In this case, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu prepares to travel to the United States to discuss the progress of U.S.-Iranian negotiations with U.S. President Donald Trump. Dialogue between Tehran and Washington has resumed for the first time since the 12-day war in Oman on February the 6th, 2025. The U.S. side described the consultations as good and expressed confidence that the Iranian leadership is willing to reach an agreement. The problem, however, is that Tehran is unwilling to make concessions on key issues: uranium enrichment, its ballistic missile program, and assistance to loyalist groups. The Israeli Prime Minister had originally planned to meet with Trump at the White House on February the 18th. However, as U.S. officials told Axios, Netanyahu requested an earlier date. This occurred on the day the U.S. and Iranian delegations met in Oman. A source familiar with the upcoming talks, according to Axios, notes that Netanyahu's visit is intended to convey to the Iranian leadership that Trump has other options if the diplomatic process fails. However, as previously reported, the Jewish state believes that a full-scale operation against Iran requires a more powerful force than the one the U.S. has amassed since mid-January. The Muscat talks took place in several rounds. Omani diplomats acted as mediators between the Americans, led by Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and the Iranians. Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of the U.S. Central Command, also participated in the dialogue for the first time on the American side. There are no signs yet that Tehran is ready for significant concessions. In an interview with Al Jazeera, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who led the Iranian delegation in Oman, stated that his country will not abandon uranium enrichment for civilian purposes. Why do we insist so much on enrichment and are not prepared to give it up, even if war is forced upon us? Because no one has the right to dictate what we should do, the Iranian diplomat said. He also noted that Tehran is emphasizing diplomacy and negotiations. If they choose diplomacy, we will follow the same path. If they speak to the Iranian people respectfully, we will respond respectfully. But if they speak the language of force, we will respond with force, Araghchi said.
Russia's investigative committee said Sunday that the man suspected of shooting a deputy chief of Russia's military intelligence agency in Moscow was detained in the United Arab Emirates and handed over to Russia. According to Associated Press, Lieutenant General Vladimir Alexeyev was hospitalized after being shot several times Friday by an assailant at an apartment building in northwestern Moscow, the investigative committee said. The attack followed a series of assassinations of senior military officers that Russia has blamed on Ukraine. Investigative committee spokesperson Svetlana Petrenko said a Russian citizen, Lyubomir Korba, was detained in the UAE on suspicion of carrying out the shooting. It has been established that Korba arrived in Moscow at the end of December last year on the instructions of the Ukrainian Special Services to commit a terrorist act, Petrenko said. According to the investigative committee,
2 accomplices had been also identified, one of whom was detained in Moscow and another who left for Ukraine. Russian Federal Security Service footage shows a Marikov pistol with a silencer allegedly found by investigators near the scene of the shooting. Asked about the shooting, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Friday it would be up to law enforcement agencies to pursue the investigation, but described it as an apparent
Iranian leaders declared that they will not give up the uranium enrichment, even if it means war. Now, after reaching a dead end in the negotiations in Oman, a new threat is coming from Iran in the form of an image of Tel Aviv, an Israeli city, and a declaration that there will be a rain of missiles on Israel. Meanwhile, Iranian Foreign Minister Arakshi revealed the United States' condition for stopping the escalation and laughed at President Trump in front of the reporters. President Trump replied that Khamenei should be very worried. And at the same time, Iran is also trying to rebuild its ballistic missile arsenal, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is headed to Washington this week for an emergency meeting with President Trump, as the question of whether or not the United States will strike Iran hangs in the balance. But Israel isn't the only country trying to influence this decision, as the Arab states are worried about Iran's response to any American attack, while some analysts are warning about surprises that could be waiting for United States and Israeli forces. So welcome to Boots on the Ground. I'm your host, Yair Pinto, bringing you all the truth about what's happening in Israel and in the wider Middle East. After the visit by White House envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, Iran responded with a threat against Israel, erecting another large banner in Tehran's Palestine Square depicting a map of central Israel alongside the words, "facing a rain of missiles." This is a small area. The chief of staff of Iran's army also declared that the consequences of any regional war in the area will fall on Washington and Tel Aviv. Foreign Minister Arakshi also declared that Iran will not give up its nuclear program, even at the price of war, saying that our atomic bomb is the ability to say no to the great powers. He also laughed as he was telling the journalist what President Trump is demanding Iran to do in order to avoid a military strike. In this context, he should remember that for many years, regime officials have denied that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons and insisted its nuclear research programs were entirely peaceful. In any case, while the possibility of an American strike is still hovering in the air, Israeli officials are worried about an agreement that will not include Iran's missile arsenal and support for terrorist proxies. Prime Minister Netanyahu is on his way to Washington this week to try and persuade President Trump to insist on these issues being addressed. Netanyahu will also assure President Trump of Israel's readiness to participate in any kind of military strike on Iran. And meanwhile, the IDF is carrying out a targeted elimination inside the Gaza Strip and monitoring Hamas, trying to manage the rehabilitation of the terrorist organization and waiting for an American move to disarm it. The terrorist organization Hamas, as usual, lies blatantly and tries to promote a false claim until the next explosion. Senior Hamas figure Khaled Mashal presented an alternative framework for disarmament this week, although in practice, this is an entry into rehabilitation process in which Hamas will prepare for another campaign against Israel. And in a related story, Turkish President Erdogan and his government conducted an intensive round of talks with senior figures in Hamas this week, along with talks with the Palestinian Authority in order to discuss the rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip after this war. Only later did Turkey's real goal in the talks become clear. In the northern arena, Hezbollah in Lebanon is tired of getting hit by the IDF, and a dramatic change of direction has been announced by Naim Qassem, the CEO of the terrorist organization. According to reports in the Lebanese media, after the blows it suffered in the war with Israel, Hezbollah is undergoing a reorganization concentrating authority in the hands of the current Secretary General, prompting political figures and removing senior religious officials. So we have a lot to talk about today, so let's dive into the hard questions. For instance, will the negotiations bring Iran's surrender to the United States, including handing over the enriched uranium dismantling the ballistic missiles and dismantling the proxy array from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Hamas and the militias in Iraq and Syria? Or is this actually a deliberate way to accumulate more power?
All right, guys, welcome to the
plans,
stream.
and maintain a deception
If you
plan
guys have
against the
any
Iranians? I'm Yair
links,
Pinto, and this
something
is your
news
Boots on the Ground report,
that you
bringing all
want
the
to
truth
share,
about what's happening in Israel on
post
day
it in the chat, have a look
856 of
over
the
it,
war
and
against
we
Hamas,
can definitely
Hezbollah,
play it.
the Houthis in Yemen, the
Feel
Shia
free to
militias
do
in
that
Iraq, and all the other
hang
armed
out
groups
with
in
me
this region,
while I'm
taking the
watching
orders from
different
Iran's
types
Islamic
of
Revolutionary Guards
news.
Corps, which is the head of the
It's a lot of
crumbling
things
axis of
going
evil
on
in the Middle East. And a moment before we begin,
week
look
and
for me,
weekend.
for TBN Israel,
I was not
for Mati
live this
Shoshani,
weekend,
for Yair
but
Pinto on social medias.
I know
because
it's a lot of things
we
going
are
on, so
uploading
I'm just
constantly
scalpering
about
around, trying to
everything
find
that's
some
happening.
news.
And if you want to stay up to
so
date and
drop
know
your
how to
link
pray
if-
for the
if you
situation,
guys want to,
that's the
I
best
definitely
way.
want to look
In
at
the
it.
meantime, if you haven't subscribed
cool,
to TBN Israel on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. The banner hung this week in Palestine Square in the heart of Tehran, depicting a map of central Israel and the caption, "Against a rain of missiles, this is a small area. Lets everyone know what Iran's intentions are." Beneath the map is a list of cities: Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Herzliya, Ramat Gan, Bnei Brak. The last line of caption read, "For the first day," meaning on the first day of an American attack, they plan on saturating central Israel with ballistic missiles. So is this just psychological warfare or an organized preparation for the day after the collapse of the negotiations? Meanwhile, the latest round of talks in Oman ended without a breakthrough, and the Americans continue to push for a broader agreement, while the Iranians insist on only discussing nuclear issues, and even there, they are not sure about what they want to discuss and reject all the American demands. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi repeated that Tehran is ready to talk about certain limitations, and not to give up the very right to enrich uranium. He added, "The ability to say no to the great powers is our real atomic bomb." And then comes the moment that lights up red warnings all over the place. When asked about the condition that Trump set in order to stop the escalation, Araghchi answered, "Zero enrichment," and then he laughed out loud in front of all the reporters. That's not a slip of tongue, it's a message. However, as previously reported, the Americans are entering the talks with a longer list of demands, including a complete halt to the enrichment, restrictions on the ballistic missile program, and an end to support for regional proxies. On missile range, there are even numerical gaps inside the demands, including an American plan to halt the range of ballistic missiles at 500 kilometers, while in Jerusalem, they want the range to be limited to 300 kilometers to take Israel out of this range. But in Tehran, they say that in the clearest way that the issue of missiles is not up for discussion at all. And despite the obvious fact that they are in no position to dictate any kind of terms, what is up for discussion and what isn't, they still try. However, the missile threat itself is becoming the central issue of this situation beyond the nuclear file. The Iranians are trying with all their strength to build a ballistic missile project, and according to intelligence assessments that are presented, before the 12-day war last June, Iran had approximately 2,000 missiles. During the fighting, around 536 were launched, and many more were destroyed on the ground, along with the launchers themselves. Iran has made great efforts to rebuild this arsenal with assistance from China, and although they have not returned to the level of readiness they had before, they are getting close. And it's not just a matter of quantity, but the overall pace of production. Although the quality of each individual unit is not always high, there are reports that production capacity could reach hundreds of missiles per month, giving Iran the ability to overcome Israel's defensive systems through sheer weight of numbers. When analysts talk about the threat, they also talk about warheads that have the potential to be up to about half a ton of explosive per missile. This is no longer an issue of a few missiles that get through, but rather an overload scenario. For that matter, even when Israel's defensive systems work exactly as they are designed to, they cannot provide a perfect seal of protection. This is why the defensive efforts and the offensive efforts themselves to hit the launchers and the stockpiles before a launch work together. But even then, there is no guarantee of a hermetic seal. Therefore, from Israel's perspective, without dealing with the missiles, the next confrontation is only a question of time. And speaking of time, in parallel to the talks between the United States and Iran, the United States continues to use the time to build force in this region while the Ayatollah regime is printing banners and making speeches. So following the talks in Oman, the White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner took a trip to visit the sailors and the Marines on the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier. Photographs of the envoys touring the flight deck, accompanied by CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, were publicized, sending the Ayatollah regime a message that the military option has not disappeared. To the contrary, President Trump himself declared that the Iranians really want a deal, but in the same breath he said that Khamenei needs to be very worried. Now, we move to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who will be visiting the White House this week for an urgent meeting with President Trump. The official reason given for this meeting is to influence the framework conditions of the talks, as there is fear in Jerusalem of a narrow agreement that will focus only on nuclear issues while allowing Iran to continue building up its ballistic missile arsenal and supporting regional proxies. Israeli officials are worried that if Iran agrees to limits on its nuclear program, President Trump might reward them with sanctions relief, which lower economic pressure on the regime, bring money back into the coffers, and enable rehabilitation of their conventional military and the proxy terrorist groups that are surrounding Israel. The message that Netanyahu wants to deliver to Trump is that he must push Iran to agree to zero enrichment capabilities and remove the stockpiles of existing enriched uranium out of Iran. Also, Israel is pushing for limits on the range of the ballistic missiles and a gradual slowing of sanctions relief so as not to give an immediate boost to the proxies. That's what the media is reporting in public, but some analysts are speculating that all of that is just a smokescreen to hide the fact that this meeting is meant to finalize plans for a devastating joint military strike on Iran, as both Trump and Netanyahu seem to be convinced that the Iranians are not serious about being willing to back down, even on the nuclear issues that they've reluctantly agreed to discuss in these talks. However, we must also remember that President Trump does not want a prolonged war. He wants a short, sharp move with a clear outcome.
Did the U.S. just bomb Iran? Or was this another mysterious explosion inside the Islamic Republic? Early today, a loud blast was reported on Keshm Island, one of Iran's most sensitive and strategic locations, sending shockwaves across social media and raising serious questions. Keshm Island sits right next to the Strait of Hormuz, a global energy choke point where nearly 20% of the world's oil flows every day. It's also home to major IRGC naval facilities, so when people there say they heard an explosion, the world pays attention. Early this morning, videos and eyewitness reports began circulating on X, claiming a powerful boom was heard near Iran's largest IRGC naval bases on Keshm. Several open-source intelligence accounts shared clips capturing the sound of a detonation. Some described it as distant, others as nearby. But here's the key detail. There is no clear footage of damage, fire, or casualties so far, just the sound and the silence afterward. As of now, Iranian state media has said nothing. No confirmation, no denial, no explanation. Major international outlets are also holding back, leaving this story floating in the gray zone between rumor and reality. Keshm is not just any island. Keshm is Iran's largest island and a military hub for the IRGC's naval forces, used for patrols, drills, and asymmetric warfare. Any incident here instantly raises alarms because even a small miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz can spiral fast. Iran has seen a string of unexplained explosions in recent weeks: Bandar Abbas, Awaz, Karaj, Tabriz. Officials blamed most on gas leaks or industrial accidents, but the pattern is starting to make people uneasy. Was this another accident? A weapons test gone wrong? Sabotage? Or something meant to send a message? Right now, there is no evidence to support any theory. This comes amid rising U.S. Iran tensions, naval incidents near Hormuz, and threats tied to Iran's nuclear program. That's why even an unconfirmed explosion can rattle markets, governments, and military planners. So was Keshm rocked by a routine accident or something far more serious? For now, this remains a developing story. But one thing is clear: the Persian Gulf is on edge, and every unexplained boom matters.
Welcome back. We are joined again by Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, to discuss what appears to be war coming sooner rather than later to Iran. At least the world has its eyes now on Iran, given that the United States continues to mobilize more and more military assets to the region. How should we read this? Is this preparation to war, or is this just the U.S. building up, some show of strength during negotiations?
Well, I was hoping it was simply an intimidation gesture, but what I'm hearing from friends that are still involved with national security matters, this is far more serious. They've described it as it's one of two things. This is either going to be a reprise of Midnight Hammer. The United States launched B-2 raids into northern Iran. Of course, that was done in, let's call it collaboration or coordination with Iran. Or they're preparing for an Israeli attack and to be able to come back up Israel. One of two things. It didn't say this was to try to force Iran to make concessions at the negotiating table. The other, I see it as a warning indicator. There's a former Undersecretary of Defense, a gentleman named Stephen Bryan. And I know Stevens. I like him. I consider him a friend. We're acquaintances via email and Zoom calls. But he's a Zionist. And I'm not using that as a pejorative. I mean, that's his view. Believes that God gave that land to Israel and they have a right to occupy it. However, he is very moderate. He's not a Ben Gvir crazy or a Smotrich crazy. And he writes good, solid analysis. Well, he put out a piece 2 days ago reacting to the recent negotiations between the United States and Iran. It was very emotional. I mean, just tearing Witkoff apart and describing that Iran is using a rope-a-dope strategy, referencing Muhammad Ali, the technique of allowing a puncher to punch out, until they would exhaust themselves, and then they could strike back. So when I'm seeing someone like Steve get that emotional, that there is enormous pressure now coming down on Trump to attack Iran. And the issue now is, they moved on from nuclear weapons. It is ballistic missiles and support for Hamas and Hezbollah, which is just, particularly the latter, support for Hamas and Hezbollah, complete red herring. The rhetoric and claims by Israel don't match the facts. And I saw your recent debate with his fellow Joel Rosenberg. Thought you did an excellent job. But again, he continued to put out the lies that massive terrorist attacks by Hamas and Hezbollah. And if you just I challenge anybody, go do the research. There are plenty of AI search engines out there. Just ask the questions. How many Israelis have been killed by Iranian proxy groups since 1982? Because that's when Hezbollah came into existence. And the answer is fewer than 5,000. And you match that up against the 70,000 plus Palestinians that have been murdered by the Israelis during the course of the last 2 years and 3 months. So it just doesn't add up. So this is, Trump is under great pressure now to attack. And I think that's one of the reasons Bibi Netanyahu's coming to town, not just to press Trump to do it, but also to coordinate. I think it's highly likely we could see violence in the next 2 weeks. I hope I'm wrong. I'd love to be wrong.
Yeah, I thought that debate was interesting because it's so dishonest. But you see this always with the arguments, because they say, well, look at this government. They treat their population so horribly, and the whole pitch is quite manipulative. But then when you ask, well, what do you tend to achieve with a military strike like this? Because if you look at all your previous military adventurism over the past 20, 30 years, which one has ever led to success? And then, well, we didn't stabilize any government, but we created chaos, divisions to make sure that they would be weak enough not to threaten Israel. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say on one hand that the key objective is to create chaos and instability and hardship for people. At the same time, you're doing it because you want to help them. So it's all, if that's your goal, you think that every country in the entire region have to be divided, destroyed, and in chaos in order for Israel to security, make that argument. I just find it very dishonest that they have to pretend they're humanitarians, like caring about protests while they're actually doing everything you can to destabilize the economy, pumping weapons in, fueling violence. I mean, it's again, at least if you say we want to destroy the Iran, at least you have honesty, but there's not even that. But if we go with the first hypothesis here, though, that the objective is simply, I do not believe that's the case, but the objective is to simply put a lot of pressure on Iran in the negotiations. What actually can be achieved now with the negotiations? Because it appears that the U.S. has wedded itself to this idea that you don't just get the nuclear deal, but it has to be tied to Iran abandoning all allies, Iran giving up its conventional weapons, that is its ballistic missiles, that's its entire deterrence, and just, bet its entire future, its existence on the hope that Israel and the United States won't take advantage of its weakness.
Yeah, well, if Iran hasn't learned that lesson yet, they're going to be in bigger trouble. But I think they have. They've got 18 different types of ballistic missiles, both old and very modern. They just tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, reportedly successfully tested it. They've got 5 different types of cruise missiles. They've got in excess of 15 types of drones. So Iran has been preparing over the last, they finally came to the realization as a result of the events of the last 46 years, since the arrival of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the establishment of the Islamic Republic back in, February of February 1979, that they're at war with the United States. The United States has repeatedly attacked Iran, not the other way around. The United States is very fond of creating this narrative that it's, here we are, we're just minding our own business, looking around, and these nasty Iranians come up and attack us out of the blue. And, they cite, look, what Iran was behind the bombing of the Marines, we call it the Marine Barracks in Beirut, Lebanon in October 1983. Well, what happened in September of 1983? Oh, yeah, that'd be right. U.S. battleships, when we still had those deployed, were shelling Shia neighborhoods and villages in the Baikal Valley, killing Shia women and children. So, when we kill a bunch of civilians and then their relatives or the friends retaliate, we act surprised. From the early outset in 1980, even before Hezbollah existed, the United States is encouraging Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, and we then supply Saddam Hussein with precursor chemicals used to produce mustard gas, which, when all is said and done, when that war was over, at least 500,000 Iranians were dead as a consequence of that war. So, if you killed 500,000 of my relatives and countrymen and friends, and I was chanting death to Glenn Deason, at least you'd understand why. You killed 500,000 of my people. And again, here's the United States, a complete disconnect. We don't seem to understand that. So Iran now they're almost naive in some aspects. If you go back to October of 2024, when they launched a demonstration attack, they were wanting to show Israel what they could do with drones and missiles, hoping that would persuade the Israelis to back off. It had the opposite effect. They just assumed, Iran's weak. They took Iranian patience for weakness. And the same happened in June, the 12-day war. It continued to lie to the public about they claimed that Iran really inflicted no damage at all on Israel, when the exact opposite was the case. So now Iran's come to the place that they have drawn a line in the sand. They have been a victim again of an act of war by the West, admitted act of war by Scott Bessent, that we attacked your economy to inflict maximum economic damage on you and your people. And happy about it. Look at what we did. So now Iran is going to be fully justified, and they're prepared to defend themselves. They're not going to throw the first punch, but if attacked, they will then retaliate on a massive scale. And they're not going to stop until there is a negotiated settlement to the war that will include lifting.
Iran does not trust the United States. Despite a first round of negotiations in Oman on Friday, Tehran is not taking its finger off the trigger. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says that there is a deep distrust of the Americans and that Tehran does not believe that Washington is taking the talks seriously. And Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has called on Iranians to drive the enemy to despair. Iran's recent moves seem to be geared towards just that. Here's a report.
Iran has released an AI-generated video as part of its psychological warfare campaign. The video shows a Fatah hypersonic missile hitting the USS Abraham Lincoln. The Iranian missile is shown cleaving the aircraft carrier in two. The video comes as Iran has ordered more ballistic missile tests. Tehran is flexing its muscles by displaying the power of its arsenal. Some of the latest tests involve the Khorramshahr 4, a ballistic missile which can carry a 2-ton warhead. And coinciding with the tests is a new banner. It has been unfurled in Tehran's Palestine Square. It shows a map of Israel covered in red dots. They depict targets. And next to the map, there are models of missiles and Iran's infamous Shahed drone. Iran's message is simple. You start, we finish it. Tehran is sending out these signals even though it is preparing for another round of talks with the US soon. The country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has revealed the reason.
باید دشمن رو مایوس کرد. مایوس بودن دشمن با اتحاد شماست. با ایستادگی در مقابل وسوسه‌های دشمن است.
Iran has a number of tools at its disposal to cause despair, both to Israel and to the Americans as well. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rescheduled his trip to the US. He's going earlier than previously expected. Netanyahu will reach the US on February 11th, and he will be bringing his incoming Air Force commander with him. Netanyahu hopes to convince Trump that Iran's nuclear program cannot be left alone. The Iranians have only agreed to discuss restrictions on nuclear weapons, but Tehran says that both uranium enrichment and its missile program are red lines. However, Israel says that Iran's missiles will always be a threat. Will US President Donald Trump cater to all of Netanyahu's needs? Will he risk an all-out war that will engulf West Asia? Because Iran has no plans to bow down to American pressure. Bureau Report, WION.
A senior Iranian government official delivered a strong and uncompromising statement on February 9th, issued amid escalating tensions and growing friction with the United States. The official declared that US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could ignite a third world war if the international community fails to intervene and stop them. The Iranian representative further drew a provocative historical comparison, likening Trump and Netanyahu to infamous figures such as Adolf Hitler and Genghis Khan to underscore the perceived severity of their actions. Mohsen Rizori said, quote, "Trump and Netanyahu have done things that Hitler didn't do, Genghis Khan didn't do. And there's so much shame in it that with these recent statements that have been published from that island, everyone is going to these holes so that they can't be seen, their photos can't be published, and nothing can be said about them. This great crime, from burying alive, from ripping newborn babies to pieces from the very horrible moral actions they did, the ugliness they did, this is a trend that has started. The 21st century began with this incident. We live in a situation where we are facing a global event far removed from the face of the great devil today. So it's not just the Palestinian issue or the Iranian issue. Keep in mind that Iran has defended Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and now the Americans have come and fought Iran. They have entered the war. It's not this. The issue is much broader than this. If the world doesn't stop Trump and Netanyahu, they will start a world war. Look now, this process started in America, both North America, Canada, South America, Venezuela, and East America. Middle East, every place is in the fire of conflict, and Iran is running away from war." Unquote. In a separate remark, another high-ranking Iranian official warned that any potential US military strike on Iran would provoke a forceful and immediate retaliation. Mohammad Javad Larijani stated that Iran's military response would result in significant American any major confrontation. Mohammad Javad Larijani said, quote, "In response to a potential act of aggression, we are not looking to respond tit for tat. Our posture would move from defensive to offensive striking points where we believe we must hit the roots of that force's presence." Quote. Additionally, a third senior Iranian official revealed that Washington had recently renewed its threats of launching military strikes against Iran. The official said that the United States continues to exert diplomatic and economic pressure on Tehran, demanding that Iran accept certain conditions before any new talks begin. According to Aziz Ghazanfari, the US government presented Iran with 4 key demands that extend far beyond the scope of the existing nuclear negotiations. Ghazanfari added that Washington insisted any future diplomatic framework must include firm commitments from Iran to limit its ballistic missile development program. The US also called on Iran to scale back its support for regional armed groups and to significantly reduce levels of uranium enrichment, the official explained.
Ghazanfari characterized the overall U.S. stance as a form of psychological warfare, aimed primarily at coercing Tehran into concessions through pressure and intimidation. These developments came shortly after U.S. and Iranian officials held indirect diplomatic talks in Oman on February 6, seeking to de-escalate tensions. Officials familiar with the discussions indicated that the negotiations may continue later this week, though no official timeframe has yet been determined. Meanwhile, the United States has visibly increased its military presence and readiness posture across the broader Middle East amid rising concerns. As part of this move, the U.S. Navy deployed the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln along with a full complement of naval support vessels and assets to regional waters.
Right now, somewhere in the Atlantic, a single U.S. warship has become the focus of intense global attention. The USS George H.W. Bush, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that departed from the U.S. East Coast and is now steaming eastward across the Atlantic, is following a route that immediately raises questions. This is the traditional path toward Europe, the Mediterranean, and potentially far beyond. Officially, this is described as a scheduled deployment, but unofficially, almost nothing about it feels routine. The carrier is maintaining a faster than normal transit speed, skipping the long pauses that usually mark a calm deployment. Analysts tracking naval movements have noticed the tempo, steady, deliberate, and urgent. This is not a ship wandering. This is a ship heading somewhere specific. So the real question is simple. Is the USS George H.W. Bush on its way to Iran to reinforce the Abraham Lincoln? The George H.W. Bush is not traveling alone. It is leading an entire carrier strike group, a layered shield of guided missile destroyers and cruisers designed to protect the carrier from drones, cruise missiles, and long-range ballistic threats. On board, the carrier is loaded with the full Carrier Air Wing 7. That means F-18 Super Hornet fighter jets for strike missions, EA-18 Growlers for electronic warfare, E-2D Hawkeyes acting as flying command centers, and support aircraft ready to keep the air wing flying around the clock. In total, close to 80 aircraft are embarked, a small air force at sea, capable of launching strikes hundreds of miles inland. The escorting destroyers are just as critical. Armed with the Aegis combat system and vertical launch cells packed with interceptors and cruise missiles, they form a defensive bubble designed for one scenario above all others, operating close to a hostile coastline under missile threat. So the conversation is no longer about capability. That part is clear. The real question now is far more dangerous. Where exactly is this carrier headed, and what changes when it gets there? Here's something that often gets lost in headlines. This isn't about one ship. Right now, roughly 10 U.S. Navy vessels are operating in and around the waters surrounding Iran. That includes an aircraft carrier, multiple guided missile destroyers, littoral combat ships, logistics vessels, and surveillance platforms. And another destroyer is on the way, the USS Truxtun. Each Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries around 90 to 96 vertical launch cells. Those cells can be loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-2 and SM-6 air defense missiles, and ballistic missile interceptors. One destroyer alone can strike targets hundreds of miles inland, or defend an entire naval formation from aerial attack. Littoral combat ships, often underestimated, play a different role. They operate closer to shore, tracking fast attack craft, mines, and small boats. Exactly the type of asymmetric naval warfare Iran relies on in the Strait of Hormuz. Altogether, we're talking about thousands of sailors, dozens of radar systems, layered missile defenses, and a level of maritime awareness that makes it extremely difficult for Iran to move unnoticed. So ask yourself, is this a defensive posture, or the final setup before something breaks? While all eyes are on the incoming George H.W. Bush, the USS Abraham Lincoln is already extremely active. This carrier has been conducting high-tempo flight operations day and night, live weapons drills, missile exercises, combat air patrols, mid-air refueling, coordinated strike rehearsals, fighter jets launch, refuel in the air, simulate attack runs, return, rearm, and launch again. Electronic warfare aircraft practice jamming and suppression. Command aircraft coordinate everything in real time. This is not what a Navy does when it's just showing the flag. This is what a carrier does when it is maintaining readiness for immediate combat operations. And that matters because readiness shortens decision time. When forces are already positioned, armed, and rehearsed, escalation can happen faster than diplomacy can react. The most alarming part of this situation isn't the number of ships, it's the incidents. In early February, an Iranian drone was shot down by an F-35C launched from the Abraham Lincoln. That alone marks a serious escalation, stealth fighters engaging Iranian assets directly. Then there was the attempted interception of a commercial oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian forces moved to seize or harass the vessel, only to be stopped by the USS McFall, which intervened and forced the Iranian units to withdraw. Fast attack boats, dozens of them, have been swarming U.S. ships, not at a distance, not cautiously, but aggressively. In several encounters, Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats maneuvered dangerously close to U.S. warships, forcing evasive actions to avoid collisions. These are not accidents. They are deliberate pressure tactics. And the behavior has changed. These boats are no longer just patrolling. Crews have been observed training machine guns and rocket launchers directly at U.S. personnel. That is a direct threat, not posturing. Even more concerning, there have been attempts to interfere with flight operations, maneuvering near carrier strike groups in ways that could complicate aircraft launch and recovery from the Abraham Lincoln. Interfering with carrier aviation is one of the fastest ways to turn a tense standoff into open conflict. Because at that point, commanders have to ask a terrifying question. Was that harassment or preparation? This is how wars often begin, not with declarations, but with miscalculations. A drone shot down, a tanker almost seized, a fast boat gets too close, a missile radar locks on for a second too long, a pilot aborts a landing because a patrol craft crossed a safety zone, and suddenly restraint gives way to reaction. The arrival of the George H.W. Bush will not calm this situation. It will intensify it. Militarily, it strengthens deterrence. Politically, it raises the stakes. 2 carriers would mean nearly 160 U.S. combat aircraft within striking range of Iran. That is overwhelming power. But it is also a pressure cooker. So the real question isn't whether the United States can dominate the region. It's this: when so many armed forces operate this close, for this long, how long before something goes wrong? Because once it does, there may be no easy way back. And right now, the U.S. Navy is not pulling away. It's closing in. And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you for watching all.
The world's attention is fixed once more on tensions between the United States and Iran, as strategic postures, intense diplomatic efforts, and information campaigns converge around a crisis that has unfolded over recent weeks. At the heart of the unfolding saga is a dramatic multimedia release from Iranian state-linked outlets that has reverberated across diplomatic, military, and media circles. Iranian official media recently circulated a digitally created video portraying a scenario in which Iranian forces engage a U.S. naval formation. This video, generated with artificial intelligence tools and widely shared online, depicts hypothetical imagery of naval vessels, unmanned aerial systems, and other military platforms in a confrontational scenario with a prominent U.S. carrier hit group. Analysts describe this as part of what some are calling psychological messaging as much as a technological demonstration. Independent reviewers note clearly that the footage is not actual combat footage, but a computer-generated simulation intended to send a strategic message. The central focus of this visual release is a major U.S. Navy platform, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is part of a larger carrier hit group recently moved into the Middle East region. This group, among the most advanced embarked in the U.S. fleet, has become a symbol of American military presence and readiness in the region. It is routinely used to signal deterrence or to reinforce Allied confidence in times of heightened diplomatic friction. In Washington and Tehran alike, responses to the video have been swift and layered. U.S. military and political leaders have continued to emphasize that their movements and deployments in and around the Arabian Sea reflect a combination of defensive posture and leverage in ongoing negotiations over Iran's nuclear activities and broader regional security issues. President Donald Trump, in recent public remarks, acknowledged the movement of substantial naval assets toward the Middle East and emphasized restraint while warning of potential consequences should negotiations falter. At the same time, Tehran's leadership has used the AI video and other messaging to underline what it describes as resistance to foreign pressure and opposition to perceived threats to national sovereignty. Iranian officials have framed the release as a warning to external powers, asserting that their nation will not yield its strategic programs or accept dictation on security matters. This digital release happened against a backdrop of very real and evolving military activity and diplomatic engagement. The U.S. Central Command described this action as a measure taken in self-defense, noting that no personnel were harmed and no equipment was damaged in the encounter. The occurrence underscored the close proximity and persistent presence of opposing forces in a region already hosting tens of thousands of military personnel from numerous countries. It also illustrated the risks of miscalculation when large seagoing platforms, uncrewed aerial systems, and other assets operate near one another in constrained maritime environments like the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. In other related maritime interactions, Iranian fast patrol craft and unmanned systems were said to have approached international commercial vessels, triggering defensive support from U.S. naval units. Diplomacy has not stopped amid these developments. U.S. special envoys and Iranian negotiators have met in neutral locations in the Gulf region to discuss the future of nuclear diplomacy and broader arrangements intended to reduce tensions. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has publicly stated that Tehran is open to negotiations that reflect what he describes as fairness and mutual respect. Still, there is an unmistakable juxtaposition between these diplomatic gestures and continued military demonstrations. In recent weeks, the US has bolstered its regional presence with additional air defense systems, carrier hit elements, and support infrastructure in neighboring countries. Several guided missile destroyers, combat aircraft, and additional personnel have deployed alongside the carrier group. These movements have been described by US officials as preparatory and defensive, intended to assure partners and to respond to potential contingencies as negotiations proceed. Political leaders from allied nations have echoed appeals for de-escalation. European capitals, Gulf monarchies, and international organizations have all urged restraint and emphasized the importance of diplomacy over confrontation. Some have reiterated that the movement of large naval forces and the depiction of worst-case scenarios in media, digital or otherwise, can inflame public opinion and complicate already fragile negotiations. In Tehran, state media personalities framed the AI-generated video release as a symbol of resistance to external pressure. Coverage included commentary asserting that Iran's defensive capabilities, both conventional and unmanned, have matured to the point where foreign military assets must reconsider their assumptions. Such narratives stress sovereignty and deterrence, themes common in Iranian official statements on national security. The use of artificial intelligence to produce military-themed scenarios represents a relatively new facet of informational statecraft. Analysts note that while the underlying technologies are neutral, their applications in strategic messaging can blur the line between simulation, dissuasion, and provocation. Digital simulations can evoke strong reactions precisely because they appear visually striking and leverage modern expectations of what real footage might resemble. Observers caution that this kind of messaging must be critically evaluated in context. The internationally recognized U.S. Navy and independent defense analysts confirm there has been no verified imagery of an actual exchange between the Abraham Lincoln hit group and Iranian forces as depicted in the AI video. Officials in Washington stress that the carrier group remains a defensive and stabilizing presence. In the meantime, global markets have reacted to the broader tensions. Oil prices in international trading hubs experienced modest upticks as traders priced in the potential for increased friction in key energy corridors. Maritime insurance premiums have shifted, previewing the economic ripple effects that geopolitical uncertainty can exert far from the immediate area of operations. Critics of hardline postures on both sides argue that aggressive displays, whether digital or physical, risk creating feedback loops that encourage further escalation. They point out that in past episodes of tension, misinterpretations and rapid reactions have sometimes driven confrontations closer to actual conflict than either side publicly acknowledges. International law and customary maritime practice remain central reference points for diplomats and military planners alike. The rules governing freedom of navigation, the right of passage, and the rules of engagement at sea are subjects of significant study as naval forces from various nations share increasingly crowded sea lanes. In statements to allied governments and to the press, US officials have underscored their commitment to stability and to defending internationally recognized legal rights. These include safeguarding merchant shipping, protecting service members, and ensuring that diplomatic negotiations are given the space to succeed without undue pressure. Tehran's messaging, meanwhile, has focused on elements of national dignity and resistance to perceived coercion. Iranian leaders emphasize that long-standing grievances over sanctions, economic constraints, and regional security imbalances feed into their strategic calculus. They argue that defensive capabilities and national resilience are essential components of national policy. As the region continues to watch closely, world capitals far beyond the Middle East are assessing the potential impacts on trade, energy markets, and the broader international order. Organizations such as the International Maritime Organization and the United Nations Security Council have monitored developments, urging calm and adherence to international norms. For citizens in countries directly involved and for global audiences, this complex episode is a reminder of how modern technology, media strategy, and real-world military deployments intersect in today's geopolitical landscape. In an era of satellite monitoring, digital simulation, and instantaneous communication, images and narratives can have nearly as much influence as physical movements on the ground. At its core, the situation underscores the urgency with which diplomatic solutions are sought. Leaders face competing pressures to demonstrate resolve to domestic audiences, to protect strategic interests abroad, and to avoid uncontrolled escalation that could draw in additional actors or destabilize broader regions. International mediators continue to advocate for renewed discussions on nuclear issues, ballistic missile constraints, and confidence-building measures that may reduce suspicion and create conditions conducive to durable peace. In summary, the release of an AI-generated depiction of a hit on a US naval formation is the latest chapter in a larger set of developments spanning military postures and diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Iran. It reflects enduring friction over strategic priorities, divergent interpretations of national interests, and the challenges of communication in an era where digital imagery can influence public perception as much as official policy pronouncements.
And over in the Iran-US front, Iran does not trust the US despite a first round of negotiations that took place in Oman on Friday. And this is as per Iran's request to hold the talks in Oman, not in Turkey, where they were earlier scheduled. Tehran is not taking its fingers off the trigger even now. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi says that there is a deep distrust, quote-unquote, of the Americans, and that Tehran does not believe that Washington is taking these talks seriously. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has called on Iranians to drive the enemy to despair. Iran's recent moves seem to be geared towards just that. Here's a report. Take a look.
Iran has released an AI-generated video as part of its psychological warfare campaign. The video shows a Fatah hypersonic missile hitting the USS Abraham Lincoln. The Iranian missile is shown cleaving the aircraft carrier in two. The video comes as Iran has ordered more ballistic missile tests. Tehran is flexing its muscles by displaying the power of its arsenal. Some of the latest tests involve the Khorramshahr 4, a ballistic missile which can carry a 2-ton warhead. And coinciding with the tests is a new banner. It has been unfurled in Tehran's Palestine Square. It shows a map of Israel covered in red dots. They depict targets. And next to the map, there are models of missiles and Iran's infamous Shahed drone. Iran's message is simple. You start, we finish it. Tehran is sending out these signals even though it is preparing for another round of talks with the US soon. The country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has revealed the reason.
باید دشمن رو مایوس کرد. مایوس بودن دشمن با اتحاد شماست. با قدرت فکر و اراده شماست. با انگیزه شماست. با ایستادگی در مقابل وسوسه های دشمن است.
Iran has a number of tools at its disposal to cause despair, both to Israel and to the Americans as well. These are the US bases within striking distance of Tehran's missiles. And it seems like Iran has a rocket for every occasion, no matter the distance. This versatile arsenal is why Israel insists that Iran must be forced to limit its missile program. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has rescheduled his trip to the US. He's going earlier than previously expected. Netanyahu will reach the US on February 11th, and he will be bringing his incoming Air Force commander with him. Netanyahu hopes to convince Trump that Iran's nuclear program cannot be left alone. The Iranians have only agreed to discuss restrictions on nuclear weapons, but Tehran says that both uranium enrichment and its missile program are red lines. However, Israel says that Iran's missiles will always be a threat. Will US President Donald Trump cater to all of Netanyahu's needs? Will he risk an all-out war that will engulf West Asia? Because Iran has no plans to bow down to American pressure. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
Welcome to the channel, everybody. Iran dropped a AI-generated video yesterday that shows them supposedly sinking the USS Abraham Lincoln and all of its escorts, mind you. Not just the carrier, but everything else. Here's a little sneak peek at that video. Wow. Yeah, very interesting, right? And even the US forces on the ship are wearing World War II outfits. So you can tell that there is a lot of accuracies in this video. But throughout the video, you see waves of drones, ballistic missiles, and also the Fatah 2 hypersonic missile hammering the carrier until it basically breaks apart. We'll do a full reaction to that video at the end, so stay to the end of the video for that. The focus, though, is the Fatah 2, which they're bragging about as being an anti-ship weapon, and they're saying that they can hide it on even smaller vessels. So this is in line with a lot of the propaganda that we've seen coming out of Iran. Very dramatic, but stick around because we're going to talk about the I.O., the information operation that Iran is basically dropping, well, on the world, essentially, but specifically on their own population. And this is coming in just a few days after an F-35C downing that Shahed 139 drone that was coming in with that aggressive style, direction, and behavior in the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, indirect nuclear talks wrapped up in Oman. Both sides call it a good start, but nobody budged on the enrichment limits, missiles, or the proxies. And the Lincoln Strike Group is still sitting there as a very visible reminder that, hey, Iran, you might want to negotiate in a little more good faith. But this is straight up information warfare mixed with real brinksmanship at the same time with the talks going on. And it matters because carriers are the ultimate symbol of projecting force anywhere on the planet. And Iran's basically flipping the middle finger towards those carriers. They're trying to get a rise out of the US Navy with this video, obviously. It's essentially like Iceman trying to psych out Maverick in Top Gun, but not as cool.
You're everyone's problem. That's because every time you go up in the air, you're unsafe. I don't like you because you're dangerous.
That's right.
All right, but let's talk about what Iran actually put out. The video pushed by IRGC-linked media is pure propaganda. It shows those swarms of Shahed drones coming in low, ballistic missiles, Fatah 2, dramatic shots of the Lincoln being sunk, escorts taking hits, classic Tehran-style Hollywood moves. They definitely want to show that they have bite, but at the same time, a lot of the things they're doing are completely unrealistic. We're going to review this full video, but we're also going to review some of the propaganda that they put out during the 12-day war, just to prepare you for the exact style of propaganda that we'll likely see coming out of Iran here in the next few weeks and months, depending on what happens with this conflict and negotiations. But the Iranian intercept came just days before the actual negotiations themselves. Iranian officials like Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi are warning that any U.S. strike means retaliation on American bases across the region, and also Israeli cities is one of the things that they're holding their revolver to as well. Remember, ballistic missiles are lined up to go after Tel Aviv, other Israeli cities, and at home, Iran is putting up new style banners that show explosions happening in Israeli cities. So the real asymmetric play here is their saturation. So that is actually something that's realistic from the video. Shahed 136, 139 drones, they're cheap. I mean, they can basically launch these things all day long and it doesn't impact them economically because they're so cheap. So $20,000 to $30,000 a pop. They're slow, 120 miles per hour or so, but they're launched in massive numbers from ground sites, trucks, and their goal is to overwhelm radars and force defenders to burn expensive missiles. That's their whole goal, to run the U.S. out of missiles, and you can bet they've got an estimation of how many interceptors the Iron Dome has in Israel, and then they're going to mix in decoys, electronic jamming to saturate and overwhelm the defenses. And then all the different fast boats that they're working in. That's something that I've talked about on the channel before. I've actually practiced that many times, going to operations with the U.S. Air Force, practicing shooting these boats, because this tactic is something that they very much enjoy. Their boat captains are a little bit ballsy. They're a little bit handsy, if you will, and they like to spice things up with hundreds of these boats. That's their tactic. Swarm the different ships, swarm the oil tankers, swarm whatever they want to potentially even shut down the Straits of Hormuz should things get messy. And this isn't about a fair fight to them. It's about making the cost look too high for a U.S. strike on Iran itself. That's their whole goal. They want the U.S. to maybe question and think, well, if there's even a chance of this happening, maybe we shouldn't do the strike on the regime. And remember, the entire goal of all this propaganda, just a office of propaganda sitting there pumping this out like in 1984, where the government had complete control over the population. Everybody was videoed. Any peep against the regime was shut down and you were basically executed. That's exactly what we're seeing here out of the Iranian regime. So the propaganda machine is very strong. It's kind of like Apollo Creed running his mouth before stepping into the ring with Rocky for the second time. But now I'm going to do a quick explanation of what would be competing against this exact scenario, and then after I do that, I'll react to the full video. So the F-35C is on the USS Abraham Lincoln. That's kind of the outer line of defense, on the outskirts. So that's the stealthy, sensor-packed naval version. Big wings, reinforced gear for arrested landings. The power plant pushes 43,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. Combat radius of 700 miles on internal fuel. It's perfect for strike missions or combat air patrols to protect the actual ship itself. It uses crazy sensor fusion to spot low observable threats like drone swarms very early, and then it can share that data across the whole group. And the EA-18G Growler is the electronic warfare beast that's riding shotgun with the F-35C. That's got 2 GE F414 engines, 1,300 miles per hour. Oof. No big deal, and its job is to jam enemy radars and comms, so hopefully those drones would lose link and lose guidance and just pummel into the ocean. And then don't sleep on the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye either. That turboprop bird flies high and it gives the group eyes out hundreds of nautical miles, and it can cue in everyone else to where these drone swarms are coming from. These airframes turn the carrier from a big target into a mobile networked fortress that can outsee and outreach any of these Iranian threats, in my opinion. And remember, the F-35C isn't afraid. It's got the thrust to penetrate deep into hostile airspace and get the job done in those tight spaces. So here we go, guys. Pop to X for a second for that review, but I found this video first. It's a member of the IRGC stroking this nuclear weapon. Very interesting. That's also some of the propaganda that's coming out of Iran. But let's go ahead and pop to this actual video itself. Here we go. We'll do the full run through, and yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Shahed 139 drone, that's what they shot down recently. There's the carrier, destroyer. Oh, nice. Very apocalyptic looking video. Yep, so those radars, those have been upgraded by Russia and China supposedly. So that is actually something that could be going on. And then now here's them launching those anti-ship weapons. And they definitely have a lot of these batteries. But the question is, would these still be usable? And there we go. There's the U.S. troops, the seamen on the ship wearing World War II uniforms. Basically just acting like sitting ducks. Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what the U.S. Navy would be doing. But then this boat swarm tactic, that is true. That is exactly what they would be doing. So that's not an actual falsity. And then as well as the drones. Those are Shahed 136s, Russian, Iranian drones. And then they're definitely overestimating the damage that those things would do to the actual ships themselves. But you wouldn't want one to hit one. That wouldn't be the goal, obviously. Little torpedo action, no defenses, obviously. And then all the barnacles on the bottom of the ship. That's so funny. All right, then them mining the Straits of Hormuz, that's obviously something that they are doing. So they're basically showing everything of their real tactics. They're just way overestimating their ability to execute. And then there's Fatah 2 missiles. So you would have to strike these down and take these things out. There they go. Yep, so basically showing no defenses against any of their weapons. Dude. These guys. Yeah, I'm sure the U.S. Navy would just have all of the F-35s just sitting there. Then there's the brainwashed IRGC. Oh, they're actually capturing. They're capturing the U.S. Navy. Yeah, the U.S. Navy just gave up. Yeah. So as you can see, that's the level of propaganda that the regime is spouting off. But the carrier group's real shield is layered, so having a situation like this is what it's built to prevent. F-35Cs and Super Hornets carry the AIM-120 AMRAAM for beyond visual range shots. AIM-9X Sidewinders for up close, but remember, those missiles are designed for actual aircraft as well. The escort ships pack SM-6s. Those are the missiles that can fly 150 nautical miles, that can hit aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic threats, and they're guided by Aegis radar and data links from the E-2D Hawkeye. So a lot of those are built for actual supersonic aircraft. So when it comes to cheap drone swarms, think electronic warfare, so actually disrupting the swarm itself, and then obviously trying to use microwave technology, if at all possible, to take down that swarm. A lot of the technology from Epirus looks very capable, so that could be intertwined and integrated into the actual defenses as well. But then closer in, you've got the evolved Sea Sparrow, the C-RAM, and then the Phalanx Sea-Wiz. That's a 20mm Gatling gun, spins at 4,500 rounds per minute for anything that leaks through any of those outer defenses. And then Tomahawks from the destroyers or subs can obviously strike back any of these potential locations where these Fatah 2 missiles are coming off as well. But overall, beauty is the full integration here because everything talks to each other via that secure link. And that's one of the main things you have to have That's one of the main things that separates the US military from everyone else. Growlers can jam the incoming guidance, decoys can pull missiles off course, autonomy features let systems react faster than humans can in a saturation style attack. It's not one magic bullet in this case. This is a system. This is an integrated layered defense that's designed to bleed an attacker dry before they ever get their eyes on the carriers. These systems have taken a little blue pill. They're always ready to go with whatever comes their way. Let's move to a section I like to call 4D chess. And ultimately, I just like saying that. It makes me feel cool. But if Iran uses this video for domestic morale and to signal don't push us, it's kind of their last line of defense, right? This is what they have, because they're kind of still leaving the door cracked open for more of those Oman talks while they're projecting most of their force with videos like this. So they're trying to instill doubt into the United States, into the negotiations, into what could happen should this actually turn into a regional conflict. And the regime is defiant publicly, but calculated privately, and likely privately in the actual talks themselves. They're much less defiant. They want sanctions relief, and they want to keep enriching.
ईरान ने एक ऐसा वीडियो जारी कर दिया है जिससे अमेरिका में डर का माहौल पैदा हो गया है और इस वीडियो को चेतावनी के तौर पर देखा जा रहा है। इस वीडियो में ईरान द्वारा अमेरिकी युद्धपोतों पर हमले की झलक दिखाई गई। लगभग 2.5 मिनट लंबे इस वीडियो में ईरानी ड्रोन्स अमेरिकी एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर USS अब्राहम लिंकन की तरफ बढ़ते दिखाई दे रहे हैं और कई मिसाइलें दिखती हैं जो जहाज़ों पर हमला करती नजर आ रही हैं। और हमले के बाद सैनिकों को डर के मारे अफरा तफरी में भागते हुए देखा जा सकता है। दरअसल ये एक AI जनरेटेड वीडियो है जो कि ईरान की तरफ से जारी की गई है। इस वीडियो को ऐसे समय में पेश किया गया जब ईरान के हालात पहले ही अमेरिका के साथ तनावपूर्ण बने हुए हैं। इस वीडियो को चेतावनी के तौर पर देखा जा रहा है, यानी ईरान अमेरिका को ये बता रहा है कि वो अपने हथियारों के साथ पूरी तरह से तैयार है। वीडियो में ये भी दिखाया गया कि ईरानी नौसैनिक जहाज अमेरिकी युद्धपोतों को पूरी तरह से घेर लेते हैं। कई सारे ड्रोन्स जहाज़ों से टकराते हैं और फिर विस्फोट के साथ उनमें आग लग जाती है। सबमरीन को भी हमले में शामिल दिखाया गया है। जहाज़ पर आग लगने के बाद अमेरिकी सैनिकों को बंदी बनाए जाने का सीन भी दिखाया गया। ईरान की ये वीडियो इस ओर इशारा करती है कि उसकी सेना, उसके हथियार
When you think of Iran's military power, what comes to mind? Most likely the Revolutionary Guards, ballistic missiles, or proxy forces. Those are what we constantly hear about in the news. But this picture is incomplete. As many are aware, Iran in fact has two separate armies. One is the ideological sword that protects the regime, the IRGC, known as the Sepah-e Pasdaran. The other is the old, deep-rooted and silent shield that protects the homeland.
American aggression. So it's pretty cynical in a way. Of course, it may be that these countries had some influence over the US decision not to attack during the height of the protests when Iran crossed President Trump's red lines.
To avoid a regional spiraling. There are also other scenarios that are considered, including the military power that's been deployed in the Middle East, which is not available in other areas around the world, as well as fear of an escalation that would hit all infrastructure, a scenario of blocking the Strait of Hormuz and a sharp rise in oil prices. This could have devastating consequences for the global economy, and we've just entered an election year in the United States. And meanwhile, inside Iran, the street is still boiling. There are reports of renewed localized protests, continued slogans against the regime, and toppling of symbols in different cities. There are also renewed calls for a showdown in the central bazaar, even as the exact numbers of these unalived in January in the streets continue to increase as reports keep coming in of what the regime did to the protesters in Iran. There are indications that the regime knows how angry their own people are, including the fact that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei rarely appears in public any longer, and his own advisors admit that he spends most of his time in protected spaces. He's obviously afraid that he's going to be targeted by somebody, because it can be his own people, and it also can be external enemies, and he's not wrong. But his rare public appearances are fueling rumors of his declining health and imminent demise.